Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, the second in the Change series. My name's Mandy Chapman and I'm the General Manager of HR Cubed. For those of you who don't know us, HR Cubed is an HR enablement consultancy focused on outcomes, not just deliverables. Our intention is really just to be allies and supporters for our HR team clients, building our customers' capabilities and not being an external threat. This webinar is part of our philosophy of giving practical support to organisations who are going through some kind of change. In particular, we've been hearing from many of our clients that they find it extremely difficult to get budget approval from their boards. And we're asking what might they do differently to gain a better outcome. I'm joined today by our Head of Change, John Hunter. John has over 25 years experience of managing complex change, and he's going to help us today not only with positioning a pitch and securing a meeting with decision makers, but he's also going to enlighten us about how to secure that all-important budget and gain a successful outcome. As we go through, if you've got any questions, please use the chat panel. A recording will be made available afterwards, so please don't feel that you have to scribble down all of what John's talking about. So without further ado, I'll pass you on to John Hunter. John.
Thank you, Mandy, and welcome everyone. As Mandy said, this is an area we quite often discuss with our clients, and so we thought it would be good to cover it in one of our webinars. So I'll quickly share what we're going to run through today. We look at the context of seeking funding for change, and we'll follow up by how you can prepare for the opportunity and maybe finish off with some thoughts on style and substance. As ever, this is a mix of anecdote and experience as well as some solid good practice. So I do hope it will be interesting and useful in equal measure. So let's start by seeing if we have a common understanding around what we all mean by the term change. A colleague of mine used to say there are 101 different flavours of what change is in people's heads. It may not be quite that number, but it's far from clear that we all mean the same thing when we say change. It can be helpful to remember that change is usually a means to an end rather than the end itself. So here's some examples. The IT community used the term in relation to the traditional ITIL definitions where change is change control. Somebody wants to make a change in a system or a process, and a change control process is followed. Others think of change as perhaps in terms of a specific event where organisations are being asked to change the way they do something, a specific process or an action. You might consider this more of a point solution management activity, and a good example of that would be solution adoption of a process or a technology. A few might take the more philosophical high-end view that change is a mindset shift for the ecosystem of an organisation. It is something that can be enabled or released, but may be a long, slow process rather than a big bang event. Most recently, we see this advocated as emergent change. But the slice of pie I've found myself tugging into most often is the one which looks at the wider impact of change on an organisation and how that might be promoted or mitigated and, of course, managed. You could probably think of this as programmatic change or holistic change management. Whatever your particular flavour or interest, it's possible and indeed even probable that it will vary slightly from that of the various members of your board. Now, a particular experience of mine drove this home. Around 5 years ago, I was working in Canberra within an Australian government department. They were looking to resolve the operational issue which had developed within their multi-vendor environment, and I'd been introduced as at the program steering committee and given the title Change Director. Now, during the meeting, I was asked by the program leader to give an overview of some of the change initiatives I was recommending, which were there to help mitigate the negative disruptive impacts they were going to experience when the new operating model was adopted. So I ran through my initial thoughts, gave some recommendations, and outlined how we might work collectively together to nail down where the impacts were going to be. Now, I noticed one of the steering committee members looking a little confused and more than a little hostile. Let's call him Bruce. So after the meeting, I offered to buy Bruce a coffee. Now, it turned out that he was one of the vendor contractors who had responsibility for change in his company's version of the change control process, so the ITIL process from an IT organisational perspective. And Bruce thought I was proposing adding all this implementation work, as he saw it, to his team, and was understandably hostile to this as he had no budget, no experience in these areas, and no contractual cover to provide that service. So that was one of the best coffee investments I ever made, as I was able to surface a key misunderstanding and a potential blocker to success, all of which was based on a conceptual misunderstanding of what we both meant by change. So what's your takeaway from this? Well, be clear about what you mean by change and make sure you can articulate it clearly. The board members may not agree with you, however, that's much easier to deal with than a fundamental misunderstanding. So perhaps you're an HRD or a senior leader within your organisation and you've identified that they need to invest in change. Maybe technology-based, process-based, behaviour and culture-based, or indeed any of a long list of potential business drivers. Now, you're clear in your mind about what sort of change this is and what you mean by change. Having identified what the problem or opportunity is, you then work out what needs to be done to get the best outcome for the organisation. And what happens next? Often, leaders in this position find they are unable to obtain the necessary funding, so exactly nothing happens next. And as a community, we really should be asking ourselves why that usually happens, particularly within the HR purview, and what can be done to maximise the chance of obtaining funding for a change programme. So why is it that obtaining funding for a change programme can be such a challenge? Well, much of this is down to the preconceptions and lack of understanding in boards around what managing change involves and how it relates to the organisation. A useful place to begin might be with the board's perception. Does your board see the ability to deliver change well as a valuable asset? Do you know what is driving their opinions? Is it experience, preconceptions? Sometimes they have a distinctly chilly view of the value of management change. It's an expensive insurance policy, or it's just a bit of comms and training. It's a nice to have, but it's not business critical. Sometimes they can be a bit more ambivalent and feel it isn't something for their organisation because it's just for mega projects or very large complex business models. Or it's a good thing in principle, but I'm not totally clear on what or why, or indeed it's mostly about culture or development and not delivering business process outcomes. So based on my experience, having identified the problem, you need to work on the principle that being forewarned and is forearmed. So perhaps you have discovered that the board is chilly and closed, or perhaps they are positive and open. This is just the starting point of your journey to find investment. You should probably also consider that even if you can obtain access to the board and a slot in the agenda, despite the chilly reception, you may also face considerable competition for the funding you seek. So welcome to the unlevel playing field. While it's not really helpful to think about boards as adversaries, there are some important things to remember. All board members are not created equally. The CEO, MD role is not to be an expert, but to be a decision maker, and that decision is based on the best expert information they can obtain. The FD's responsibility is diverse and complex, incorporating fiscal responsibility, governance and reporting. Many also see themselves as the organisational gatekeeper for funding. ITDs, CTOs, COOs are frequent funding demanders. They have become increasingly adept at presenting their investment requirements with clear, strong messages that make it easy for FDs and CEOs to say yes with confidence. So, let's recap. You're playing uphill against a chilly wind surrounded by more experienced competition. It is no wonder then that so many change projects are stopped before they begin or are watered down to the point where they meet the low expectations of the board, reinforcing their pre-existing opinions. Given that this is a common mindset, perhaps it's helpful to consider the board meeting not as an act of collegiate discussion looking for the right organisational answer, but something else. So, is it a pitch? Oh, hell yes. Are you pitching a sure thing? Absolutely not, given the probable bias of the board. So what are you going to do to make sure the message gets through and you secure the budget that you need. A key area to consider when prepping is context. What is the business or organisational outcome this will achieve? For example, funding this project will deliver profitability improvement. That's your what. Performance improvement, cost reduction, release of resource for reallocation is your how. Or maybe funding this project will deliver market share improvement. That's the what. Access to new markets and new offerings, and those are the hows. Your most effective approach should be to hang your proposition off the hooks of the board's decision points. This is the starting point for how you should present. It's also one of the most frequently mishandled areas around obtaining budget. Although it can be tempting talking about features or potential utility, unless it specifically supports a business outcome, don't lead on it. You may find your proposition is less exciting or eye-catching than some others. And if this is the case, the outcome and the business objectives are exactly the position you need to take up. It may also be useful to remind the board that sometimes they need to do the important rather than just the urgent. It's time to gain the attention of the board. So what are you going to do to prepare yourself? Well, one of the first things that go wrong in many pitches is a lack of clarity around what the person pitching wants. Be specific. If you want funding, then how much do you want? If you want additional resource, then be specific about how much and what kind. A next area many pitches fail in is not because the pitch is disconnected from what the organisation needs, but because at some point in the process a specific question cannot be answered because the presenter doesn't know or hasn't prepped. You need to have details available, well organised and to hand, but you want to have the correct information, especially facts already in your head. And we'll cover style and impact later. However, having inaccurate information, especially around the costs or ROI projections, is a huge knock to your credibility. And I would urge you to invest time in this. So, for example, if your pitch is a purchase of a new system, then ensure you know the details around the implementation time, amount of support required, the implementation, the licensing agreements, the get-out clauses, etc., etc. So let's move on to the next one, the support material. It's actually easy to skip or give low attention to this aspect. I'd urge you to not be tempted to just copy a brochure or other salesware from the potential vendor, and nor should you counter this with a huge tome covering your presentation. The purpose of the support material is to provide a synopsis for decision making. So returning to our guiding principles, work out what they need to make the decision and give it to them. It goes without saying you need to ensure that this is bomb-proof in terms of accuracy and quality. No last-minute rushed-together PowerPoint or Word document. Depending upon the decision-making style and culture of the board, you may have already been asked to provide a business case, so whatever is in the business case should tie in with the support material. If it doesn't, someone will spot it and they'll call you out on it. If you are soft in a particular area, finance for example, then you should invest time making sure you can handle questions here without getting thrown off track by the FD. You need to be able to explain where you have made assumptions and what you base those assumptions on. You don't have to be a finance expert, but you do have to understand the measures which are in play and which may be relevant. So, how does your organisation measure financial performance? EBIT, EBITDA, or you may be asked how this will impact the current P&L for this financial year. Having basic answers to these questions can be the difference between success and failure. So think about each of the people in the room, work out what their concerns or areas of resistance may be, and make sure you have a position based on the evidence and facts. So, without doubt, the single most frequent reason that a pitch fails is because the numbers aren't right. Well, what does this really mean? Usually it means there's an inaccuracy either in the calcs or in an estimate or an assumption. If you put a number up, particularly around cost or financial return, especially assumptions around ROI, then triple check the maths and the assumptions are valid. It's okay for them to disagree and challenge you. However, if you can show solid calculations based upon the organisational assumptions or another organisation similar to your own experience, then you're forcing the challenger to provide additional information rather than just picking holes in yours. Now, a good CEO and MD will recognise that. And this is where the FD has the stopping power to your funding. So you never want to hear, let me take a look at the numbers and I'll get back to you. Because effectively, that's kicking the decision into the long grass and removing you from the future discussion between the FD and the CEO MD. So wherever possible, use numbers that were generated by the FD and make it clear to everyone where you got those numbers. So talking their language, this is a difficult area to get right, and I'm sure we've all heard individuals using terms which they clearly only partially understand. You may also hear buzzwords and jargon terms which are industry or even organisational specific. If you're not a board member, you may not have all the background to these terms. And normally, the safest course of action is not to ape the language, but wherever possible to understand it. Use the company accounts for the financial terms and the annual report for the general wider terms, and where possible, reflect back the language used here rather than reword it. And finally, in terms of personal preparation, there is no shame in rehearsing. Get down the points to emphasize and make sure you thin down texts or wordiness. So, assuming you've tracked down all those who will be present, or should be present, you'll need to work out their drivers. And I mentioned previously that they all have specific roles to play. However, a number of those people in the room could be your advocate or your blocker. Your job is to know who is who and why they are one or the other. You may have some individuals who are ambivalent to your pitch. It would be a good idea to understand what their key objectives are and how your proposal might impact them. Would it potentially divert funds they were looking to obtain in the same quarter? Well, that could mean that they would simply position themselves against your proposition, regardless of its merit. And as with the key roles, you should prepare yourself to answer a few key questions or potentially have some mitigations already in plan for those members. It's also useful to consider in the end if these are actual blockers who can say no or simply influencers who can seek to sway the CEO or MD. So what approaches are worth considering? Well, here's two interesting ones, but they're not without their own issues. Revealing your weak points. Now, you may wish to surface a potential issue in order to demonstrate your depth of thinking and show how this will be effectively mitigated. The benefit of this approach is that it addresses the elephant in the room. The risk, of course, is that you are pushing the attention to the potential negatives and inviting the board to dwell on them. Maybe you fancy surprise versus pre-handling. You may wish to work your way around some or all of the key decision makers prior to the meeting. This sort of lobbying approach seeks to build a consensus and surface issues excuse me, and concerns in advance. The hope is that this process will turn the board meeting into a formality. Well, you should only do this once you have fully developed your proposal. In a sense, you're running the board meeting in advance on an individual basis with these key individuals, so be careful with this. Of course, depending upon the potential resistance you're facing, it gives those opposed to your pitch an opportunity to build a case against you. Now, before this starts to sound too Machiavellian or paranoid, so much depends upon the culture of your organisation, and it very much depends upon that as to what the right answer is for you. So let's look at the third area of preparation, the environment. Now, the environment matters, and it may sound obvious, but I've witnessed last-minute room changes have a devastating impact upon a meeting or a presentation. Will you be using technology to present? What will you do if it fails? Have you got a fallback or a backup? Are the board meetings formal or more informal? Where are you on the agenda? Early on, straight after lunch, last thing? Who sets the agenda, and how can you make sure that your slot is not in the post-lunch graveyard, or, equally bad, the most likely to be cut or rushed last slot? Have you got enough time to do a pitch? If you've rehearsed, you might know exactly how long you need, but remember to allow for challenge and discussion. Now, to paraphrase Sean Connery's character Malone in the film The Untouchables, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. Don't bring your elevator pitch to the board meeting. The elevator pitch may be what you use to get to the meeting, but it simply won't do when you get there. And it's part of that credibility gap which the community needs to eliminate to be taken more seriously. So, my suggestion is, while you cannot control for every eventuality, you can identify and mitigate many potential impacts. Being able to not fall apart when things don't go as you plan will be seen as a significant strength. Style and substance. So most UK board meetings are not confrontational, but they tend to have moments of debate which can, from the outside of the group, appear uncomfortably close to conflict. If possible, it would be useful to get a handle on proposals are normally presented within the board meeting. You will have your own style. The purpose of the meeting is to get your funding. So my grandmother would say, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. Leaving aside the question as to why you would want to catch the flies, her point holds true. Striking a balance between conviction and aggression is difficult if you are the outsider. My recommendation is to be clear, concise, and rely on substance. If you are challenged, accept that the person has the right to challenge and respond with answers to their challenge. Now, most of us resist the urge to call them an idiot, but sometimes we can use loaded phrases when challenged, such as, with all due respect, which of course we all know means the opposite. Or another favourite, well, I hear what you say, which means they are talking rubbish and you disagree. I'm not suggesting you become emotionless, but you probably want to be remembered for the right reasons. You may win an argument and lose the funding, so remember what you are there to achieve. So, hopefully you can see what this is really all about, and that's trying to limit the variables. Yes, I accept it is hard work and it's time consuming and it may not in the end be successful, but the approach here I believe will significantly improve your chances of getting that funding you need. Now those of you who work in HR or change already know the experience and have experienced the credibility gap that exists. And as we touched on it earlier, the profession has been the butt of jokes and looked down upon by some for a number of years, and you may feel that this is unfair, and perhaps it is. However, the reality of the situation is that closing that credibility gap is essential for the profession and for each of us personally. So, understand the context you are pitching into, prepare yourself, the board and the environment, be all about the substance and the business outcomes, and limit the variables. Finally, get out there and get that budget because you really will have earned it by the time you do. So I'd like to thank you all for your attention and good luck in getting that budget, and I'll pass you back to Mandy.
Thank you, John. That was great. In just a second, I'm going to go to the question panel and pose some of your questions to John. Firstly, for our human resources colleagues out there, I'm going to talk HR for a couple of seconds. Now, we are passionate about HR's ability at HRCube to be a strategic partner to their organisation. And we've come up with this 1, 2, 3 slide to explain how we see the role of HR in business. 1 is delivering brilliant HR service so that all of your people are focused on the right things. 2 is HR driving value by positively impacting the wider organisation by providing the right benefits and tools. And 3, HR as an engine of innovation, providing tomorrow's HR today, impacting the bottom line and ensuring that the all-important competitive advantage. We do most of this through 5 key service cogs, which you can see now. Firstly, diagnostics, whether that's within HR itself or wider organisational diagnostics. Process improvement, so ensuring that your processes are aligned and efficient. Organisation design, ensuring that your organisation design, the people that you have and the roles that they perform are aligned with process and technology. Ensuring that the technology that you have or that you need to go out to market and get is going to support your business outcomes and your business objectives. And finally, the area of John's expertise, managing change for positive outcomes. Now, if you have any questions about the 1, 2, 3 slides or this support available slides, please do let us know. I'm going to go straight to the question panel. We've had a few questions here, John. The first one from Sarah, and she asks, what if they bump the slot repeatedly?
Yes, that's not an uncommon experience for many of us. It's probably an indication of a couple of things. Disinterest, which is they see it as not important or potentially not relevant to them. Maybe they've prejudged that rather than looked at what you've put out there. If that's the case, you need to work probably outside the board meeting itself to build a consensus amongst the board members that this needs to be resolved. And I've often used the technique of building some momentum within the board members' immediate reports too, so you get a bit of upward pressure. And that can be quite a useful way, and so you're using your relationships within your organisation to drive them to the table in a sense. The other side of that coin is it's not disinterest, it's actually full-on resistance. Probably it's competition-based, it's for spend. It could be philosophical, so they could just believe that it's the wrong thing and you shouldn't be doing it. But whichever it is, you need to be able to identify where the resistance is coming from and put a counterposition into the minds of the MD or the chairperson to the point where you have secured your slot again, and maybe they're willing to have the debate at a board level. But that's what I do, Sarah, in those circumstances.
John, having listened to what you've presented, would you say, and from Sarah's question, would you say that one of the most important aspects of what you're positioning here is all to do with relationships?
It is, but I don't think you can rely on relationships alone, and that's why there's so much prep. You can get on really well with the FD, but don't expect them not to ask you some tough questions if you're asking for funding. But yes, it's a good way of engaging with your organisation by using your relationships.
Great. Thank you, John. We have another question here from Naz. Naz says, if you get rejected by the board, what then? Do you give up or come back again until you win them over?
That's a really good question, Naz. I would say that that's probably a question that could go either way. If you've had your airtime at the board and if you feel you presented well and gave the facts well and had a hearing, then there is a point at which you have to accept that the role of the board is to make a decision. And they've made that decision based on the information that you've provided, but also other information that they've got to hand. So there is a point at which you have to stand up and say, okay, that's the decision of the board, I move on, and we'll keep an eye out for an opportunity in the future if circumstances change. The essential piece of that information there is that you know why they've decided to do what they do. Now, if you're rejected and you get no reason for the rejection, then I think and this depends slightly again on your relationship with the MD, but I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask for feedback as to why it was rejected, and then you can decide based on that information if you missed something or if you completely hung something off the wrong hook for the wrong person, or if it's just a classic piece of bad timing, so that they've decided to put the money into something else because that's seen as a higher priority than what you were pitching. Of course, you could argue that you should have known that in advance. So I think it depends, but by and large you have to allow the board to fulfill their function and make the decision, and as long as you've done your bit, then I think that's fair enough.
Okay, great. We have one last question, so if anybody else online would like to pose a question now, please do so in the chat panel and we'll pick it up. A question here from Francis, who says, I pitched an HCM solution and had a preferred candidate. The board unfortunately went with another vendor. What could I have done differently? He doesn't give any more information about this one, John, but do you have any ideas from your experiences?
Well, without context, there are a lot of reasons why that could be the case, not the least of which is that there may be relationships, historical relationships between the board and the board member and the vendors that you're just not aware of. But probable for that area is that you have not hung the outcome message quite strongly enough. So is there an aspect of what you were offering that talked about the features and functions of the HCM solution that focused on we can do X, Y, and that therefore it's better for the department when it might not matter to the board, because you being slightly easier for the department to deploy and use is not necessarily top of their list of activities. And indeed, Mandy and I have worked with clients in the past where when you look at the processes which they deploy, putting out something that sounds like a great self-service message actually cuts across the culture of the organization. So a good example was with a particular legal firm that actually had a very, very strong PA type role for the senior partner members of the organization who would be massively negatively impacted if they had to do something on their own, and their argument would be, you know, where we're earning X £1,000 an hour and you're expecting us to fill in a holiday form, for example. So I think being aware of those sort of cultural or cross-cultural impacts in advance really, really could explain why the board will be swayed one way or another. Hopefully that's helpful, Francis.
I hope so, John. Thank you. I think that's all the questions that we have this afternoon. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this webinar. John Hunter does head up our change practice, so if you have any other questions to ask John about anything change related or indeed to do with this webinar or any wider HR Cubed questions for us, then please feel free to email either John or myself. As I said, the recording will be available shortly, and there are also other recordings in the Change series on the website at hrcubed.co.uk. Thank you again, everybody, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.